Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you're listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
So I hope you're doing great today. We are in Matthew chapter 9, and Jesus has just healed these two men who were blind. And he told them not to talk about it, and they went and talked to everybody about it. And that's a really interesting dynamic. The assumption there being he's trying to control what people are responding to, and he doesn't want his whole ministry being characterized by the flashy. His main message is, hey, the kingdom of God is near, and be watching for God, be open to God, that kind of thing. And so we're going into another, it says, that first section of 10:32, while they were going out. So here's Jesus on the move and encountering something. And so trying to, what we've been doing, if this is your first episode, is we've been walking through basically chronologically Jesus' ministry and looking over his shoulder, and we're doing a few things simultaneously. One, we're kind of looking around the room and looking at each person and that we know about and saying what from context would help us. And we talk about this in terms of giving every person dignity in the story. It's not, we don't want people to be one-dimensional. Well, the dumb Pharisee or the slow or impulsive apostle. And then the other thing is, as our name would suggest, we're responding to what's the amazing thing we notice in this experience, and what's the troubling, the perplexing thing. So in terms of context, anything you would have us look for?
So there's a couple things to give some dignity to maybe the Pharisees and what's going on. I don't have the firmest grasp of exactly what in this time of Second Temple Jew would necessarily be believing about the devil or about the spiritual realm. I have some idea, almost completely from like Dr. 𝐕𝐨𝐢𝐜𝐞 and his influence on a lot of other people. But I do get the sense that the Pharisees are going to credit all this good that Jesus is doing to a partnership basically with the devil, where he does it by the power of the prince of demons. And there's a sense in that when that hits me, I tend to think of it as almost as a turn of phrase, or almost as a ethereal something that you couldn't really think about, or he's just doing that by the power of evil or by the power of the devil, or some separate cosmic force of evil. And there's a sense in which when we think about like who the devil is or what the devil is, like that part is true. But my understanding on the ground for like a Second Temple Jew is that they would have a framework for how they view the world, that there are the spiritual hosts, the angels, the spiritual beings that surround God. Think of Job and all that's going on. And oh, my bad, just elbowed the chair real hardcore. Threw a vicious elbow, like Ron Artest versus James Harden way back in the day.
I'm terrified of you now.
Yeah, no, it's brutal. So they would have the understanding that, I think my understanding is that their thought process would be that the idea of the heavenly host being on the side of somebody and somebody doing good by the power of the heavenly host being like, that would be something that would be not as alien to us. And also the idea of that there is a devil, there are demonic forces that are at play, that are fighting against the will of God, against what God wants for Israel and for his people. And so like what I want to give dignity to is like, for them, I do think there's a sense in which when they say like Jesus does this by the power of the devil, this isn't for them. I don't think, and I could be wrong here, I don't think this is a just nothing phrase you throw out there of like an ad hominem attack, which it is kind of, but it's their framework for the world is a certain framework, and for them, they either have to completely break the mold, by what Jesus is asking them to completely break the mold of how they think about God and the world, and demons and the devil and angels and all these other things, or they can fit Jesus into this box of, well, there's some tricky thing going on with demons, and when I think about it like that, it's like I do that all the time, where I'm presented with what maybe some would see as glaringly obvious factual information, and the pain of having to reorient how I view something fundamental to me is so much that the seemingly obviously good thing or fact I can minimize or can pretend is not there.
I think that actually is really fascinating to me, and I've really tried to have compassion for the Pharisees. I don't know if I've tried the right word. I've really developed compassion because I see me in them. Like every interaction, if I can take a moment and think, okay, how would I feel if I was there? You had said Second Temple Jews, and I think it's important for people that may not know. Solomon built the first temple. They had a tabernacle before that. They built the first temple. During one of the exiles, it was destroyed completely. And then, it was rebuilt during the interim, Ezra and, that era, they rebuilt it. And it was much smaller, less impressive, that kind of thing. But I think the big point here that really spoke to me is we have to remember they haven't had a prophet of God for hundreds of years. Mm-hmm. And I mean, think about if I'm telling you something about 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. So we're in, 1925, and how if something hasn't happened since 1925, we are telling ourselves it will never happen. Mm-hmm. Maybe not consciously, but I'm just saying, it's not going to happen. Like before COVID, I'd have been like, we'll never have something like the Spanish flu. And then COVID, I was like, oh, I guess we could,
sure.
But it's that same kind of thing. So I really am compassionate for them that they've never experienced it. Mm-hmm. I have never healed someone, mm-hmm. And if God suddenly started just handing that gift out to people that like, I'm not talking about just slapping somebody in the head, but I mean comprehensively curing cancer, I wouldn't believe it. Why? Because it hasn't happened in that way in terms of my understanding for hundreds of years.
Well, and you think you presented with the information of a Buddhist, not that this fits into Buddhism, per se, but a Buddhist walks down the street and somebody says, wow, that guy just healed me, or that guy just did this miraculous thing. My natural reaction is going to be, is to assume, one, I'll be like, probably didn't happen. Didn't happen the way he's saying it happened. There's something else at play. Okay, I'm presented with 100% facts. It happened. Here's some scans of something afterward. Well, maybe the doctors ran on it. Maybe they weren't. Who knows what it possibly is. But whatever his reasoning for it is, there's other things going on. Right. And it's because I have specific experiences, and I wouldn't know how to necessarily fit that into the mold. I could fit it into the mold, I think. But I think it's easy because we're on this side of it. We're like, yeah, Jesus on the right side. Jesus, so he's on the right side here.
Right.
So there's this confirmation bias that if we were. You always said something funny about if somebody walked in to your church building and said something, of oh, actually, I'm Jesus and I say this is wrong or whatever, and how you deal with the situation on somebody walking in. And that's easy. It's somebody who's obviously mentally ill walks in and says, I'm Jesus. And, that's not going to rock your world. But if a blind man can see that couldn't see before by the power of how we struggle with this one, 𝐕𝐤𝐢𝐞, and I'm going to try to say it. So somebody's healed by the power of I don't know, some Eastern religion that I don't know of, in the name of it. That is a lot more complicated.
You're exactly right. This reminds me, I showed a video one time so I'm a minister at Church of Christ. So I ministered at Church of Christ, and I showed a video of all these people being healed. And it wasn't one of these big fanfare smacking people on the shoulder. It was people praying over people, and they would get up and walk, and they couldn't walk before. Or they were blind and they could see, or they needed to find somebody and they couldn't find them, and then they found them, So they're having all these examples. And so at the end, I have about 15 minutes built in. I'm like, all we did, I didn't say anything. We just watched it. And then I stopped. And what I realized is there was a percentage of the audience, and I think it was a pretty high percentage, that wanted me to say, that's not true. Mm-hmm. And I refused to. We were so uncomfortable just at the possibility that this was true, and we could not explain it. Now, the people on the video, they were talking about Jesus and the power of Christ. And why did I feel discontent about it? Because I haven't done it, and I've never known anybody that I really trusted that has done it. And that to me is the spirit that we need to have when we get to the Pharisees on this healing.
Absolutely. Yeah, no,
So-
I think it's incredibly helpful and will hopefully give some good context. So you want to pick up in verse 32?
Yeah. While they were going out, a man who was demon-possessed and could not talk was brought to Jesus. And when the demon was driven out, the man who had been mute spoke. The crowd was amazed and said, "Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel." But the Pharisees said, "It is by the prince of demons that he drives out demons." So, now that we have a little context, what amazes you about this interaction?
Yeah, so I'm struck simply. So it says the crowd was amazed and said nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel, and I'm struck by the tension that kind of we set up early on, where there is a sense in which the Israelites have not had a true prophet rise up in a long time. And there is deep yearning for it. We have historical evidence that there are many, many people at this time, many, many Jews rising up at this time to claim the mantle of Messiah or prophet or whatever. And for whatever reasons, they just, that doesn't happen. God or religion or whatever. It's hard to litigate, each individual person, but the appetite is so strong. And yet there's still such great stagnation. And I think about what it would be like, to be in that moment and be able to say nothing like this in the history of Israel has ever happened before. And an Israelite is thinking about all of the things and all the ways that God moved in the Old Testament. And I'm in awe of what that must feel like to be people like so thoroughly convinced of all, to be people, to be the chosen people of God, that God has performed miracle after miracle, rescue after rescue, and then to be like, well, God is on the scene and he's doing something even newer like that. From the Pharisees, it's scary because it's looking different than they thought it would. But then to imagine a God so big that it's even bigger than your great tomes that you carry around and memorize, that's just incredible for me. And I never want to lose sight of that of a God who, even though he's written the book on himself, so to speak, and even though there's thousands and thousands of years of testimony of his actions and the way he moves, that in my life and in the life of Jesus, and I think in my life, there are things he's doing that no one has ever seen before. And it's pretty cool.
That really is cool. And this, I said something earlier about feeling really disconnected from 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I think I think it's correct that the modern mindset in very general is we just keep making improvements. Like the iPhone was so much better than this previous version or the smartphone in general is so much better than the previous flip phone kind of dynamic. And I think that wasn't exactly what they thought. Mm-hmm. That idea, and I don't want to make too much of the statement, but it's like that's them evaluating the whole of it and being like, this is greater than that. And they would have had real stories. Whereas I think today, like even think about the divisions between generations. Yeah. The stereotypical Gen Z saying, "Oh, boomer, hush it up," kind of thing. Even then, it's like, what relevance does 1975 have on me now? You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. You got nothing to offer me, kind of feel.
Sure.
And then we recognize that's not wise. It is, and it affects me. But they thought of history different.
Yeah.
And they thought of. And again, it's a stereotype I'm at least speaking to, whether I'm accurate or not. But it is that idea of for them to make that evaluation and then to say that. And then I see it and I'm like, yeah, I think they're right. Uh-huh. And then to make that step, why would I have the audacity to say, well, that's not happening anymore?
Yeah, well, it's the thought that restoration is going to look, the restoration is going to look exactly what it would have looked like before it was corrupted. And I think the evidence we see in the Bible and what God is after is that restoration, especially the restoration of all things, is a restoration to where it would have been, I think where it would have ultimately been if the corruption hadn't taken forth, and there would have been growth, and there would have been movement, and there would have been change, and there would have been new things. And I think for me, like this is a popular, like, in our time and place, the idea, like, many political movements are built on the idea of, like, if we could just get back to the 1950s, we could just get back to the 70s, we could just get back to a specific place in time. And I do wonder, for the Israelite, would there have been similar, like, if we could just get back to David, if we could just get back, and thinking back to when God moves, it means it's going to look like the time of David, or when God moves, it's going to look like the 1950s, or when God moves, it's going to look like the 1970s. And I think the reminder for me is that, like, I think the important thing for me to keep in front of is there was no magical time where God was more present. God was not more present in the time of King David than he is right now. And God is not more present in the 1950s of America than he is right now. And God is not more present now than he is 20 years from now or 30 years from now. And I want to be in a place and reminding myself constantly that I want to see the good and I want to see the miraculous here and now, but I also don't want it to mean down the road 20, 30 years from now when the new comes about. The new 20, 30 years from now does not negate the new now.
That to me is so well said. It really is what amazes me, is that idea that if you're hearing this and you consider yourself young, know that there will be a day where no matter how, because I experienced this, where I'm 54 and I'll hear things from the younger generation and I'll think, oh, come on, but then realize that there will be something that comes up as you age. You're like, oh, the world made so much better sense when we did it this way, or when this context, this situation existed. And that idea of when Jesus talks about new, or when people are watching him and they're like, man, this is new. We've never seen anything like this. That is an always truth to God. It says he makes all things new. And you, when you're in Christ, are new, all the time. But because we don't see it, it's gradual. We tend to believe what we see more than we believe God's promises. We don't think that way. And even the Bible seems a little bit out of touch because we're like, well, what's really that new? And it's like, well, who am I to judge? There is so much in my life that I don't realize even the implications of things till a year later, And I think that's just super important to recognize. What you said is just so good. It's that there's not a time that God was inherently, well, I'm farther away or closer. We can feel that way.
Yeah. Well, and I wonder if so much of maybe some of what's happening in the Pharisees' hearts is that sort of thing. Is like if I hear people around me saying, "Oh wow, God is moving in a new and fantastic way," it's like, well, does that invalidate all the work we've put in, all the spiritual work that we've put in for God over the past 400 years, over the entirety of my life? Like, if you're saying this new thing that's shifting the paradigm is like great and good, we all, like humans, we just tend to be like, well, that must mean that you're saying that, like, everything I did before was bad and wrong. And, like, I get the sense so much of why Jesus and the Pharisees come into conflict is because there's a sense that almost like they should be the ones to get it. They should be the ones to fully to see Jesus, and they can't for a variety of reasons. But I think it's helpful for me to see that, like, one of the things that could be going on here, this dynamic where the Pharisees is there a dynamic at play where the Pharisees truly have that sense of because this new thing is so good, that means that he must be saying, or that God is mad about the old, like, and so, like, I and there's a sense in which that's true, but I also think there were good parts about what the Pharisees did, and there were good things that they did, and there were good ways that they kept the faith alive, and like that reaction is so human, and I'm like, oh, I do that every day.
Yeah. So what perplexes you about this?
I mean, what perplexes me, again, like, I see the humanity in the reaction, and yet I become so perplexed when how easy it is for humans to go to the far end, to the extreme so quickly. To not just be like, I don't get this, I don't understand this can't be from God. I'm walking away from this, or I'm not engaging, or like this is to the far end of what they could label Jesus. And this isn't the beginning of his ministry, but it's also not the end. And I'm just struck by humanity's. This is just a repeat failure that we are constantly living in. The refusal to have any sort of humility to be able to sit in the uncomfortableness. Like we've talked about many times, the Pharisees here could just be, I don't get that. Like in a similar way, like Buddhist comes down the street, heals somebody, and like what I would hope for is I would be able to sit in it and not be able to jump in and correct the video or come down, but just sit in it and be like, I don't know what this is. But I think in the heat of the moment, I would find myself in a very similar position to the Pharisees. And I know, I tend to believe probably most people in our churches would too. And I'm just so confused at what it is about us that leads us to do that so easily and so quickly.
Well, and every time, I think that's probably accurate. Every time I feel afraid, it's because I'm confused on what to do. Mm-hmm. And if I don't acknowledge that fear, it will typically become something ugly. In my marriage, I've been married a long time at this point, and I recognize most of our biggest fights historically have been, I don't know why I said historically, I'm always talking about history, but anyway, but it is that I was afraid of something. I was confused about something. I was afraid of the implications. Like if I don't address this now, everything's going to spin out of control. And so I'm justifying being mean to my wife. I'm justifying being condescending or sarcastic or impatient with her because don't you see the greater good, And so I have compassion for the Pharisees, and simultaneously I'm like, the whole dynamic of, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights in James. It's like, and we do get a sense Nicodemus is, troubled, and, others, we get this sense in the background, but it's not it's not a majority. And I'm like, where's your curiosity? That really is the question for me. What's complexing is I get it, that there's a way this works. And then you obviously have to, and it's funny, Jesus doesn't reference it much, but the Pharisees have it clear in their mind. If this gets out of hand, we could lose what little power and control we do have, and the people suffer. And so the oppression of Rome is always on their mind, which that's another weird thing. I could always be perplexed in every encounter with Jesus, like, why are you not including Rome in this? Why are you not stressed out? But to this specifically, I'm like, where's your curiosity? And that's and where it hits is me. It's like, okay, a Buddhist heals a guy. That'll be the title. A Buddhist heals a guy. It specifically drives out a demon. And so it's like this guy is talking, and these are probably tight groups. These Pharisees, there's no indication that they're just traveling hundreds of miles. They probably traveled more than the regular person. But these are probably people they knew. So I'm like, can you at least give some tiny space for curiosity? For asking, are the Pharisees behind the scenes? Because I do understand pressure, but aren't they praying about it? When I see a people group being mistreated, I think this is a lot about race relations, and when Christians at times, not all the time, they get thrown under the bus a lot, but at times participated in racism of any kind. That's been such an easier thing in this last generation to say that's obviously evil and there's no blurred lines about it kind of thing. But I always want to say, well, I'd be on the right side of it. Well, what about the people being mistreated now that I justify, whatever that is? And I'm like, where's my curiosity? Do I have curiosity about, I wonder how God's working through this? Because we have to assume either the Pharisees were idiots and were just so dumb, or we have to assume they're average, at least intelligence people, maybe more because they had to memorize a bunch of stuff, and they struggle with what I would. hey guys, can we just do this a different way? Can we do this milder? And Jesus, he's not rebellious. Whenever he's characterized as a revolutionary, I'm like, well, not in the way like an American revolutionary was, but it was revolutionary. And there was this rebelliousness of, I'm not deferring to some code that may suit men and may keep the culture calm if it doesn't allow me to do God's will. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to do God's will, but would say, but I'm always going to defer to whatever code makes sense to me.
Yeah. And
anytime I'm deferring to a code and you don't, I'm probably pretty mad at you.
Yeah. Well, there's a spirit in which there's this whole thing swirling around Jesus. People are healed. Demons are cast out. And you get this story, and this is kind of goes hand in hand with this is a continuation of the story from last week, where you have the beginning of it where, these blind guys are basically like, we didn't really come to a full conclusion on what Son of David meant, but basically like whatever in their minds, Messiah, Savior, prophet, whatever it looks like, Jesus, you're it. And we talked a lot about the societal price that they could pay, the spiritual sacrifice they could be making by making that claim. And then you sandwich that at the very end with the Pharisees here saying this good thing, and not willing to have space for curiosity, not having space to even question or wonder. And I think about what is it like to be somebody going throughout the world. You're my childhood preacher, your former boss, mentor, whatever. Terry Rush used to always, watch for the weird, and that was his big thing. And I think about all the stuff is swirling around Jesus. All these amazing things are happening around him. And the blind people see the good happening around Jesus and allow themselves to get swept up in it. And the Pharisees see all the good and refuse, and they see all the good and refuse to allow themselves to be swept up in what God is doing. And so what I want to do is like, when I like watching for the weird and seeing all the things around it, I think the posture of a follower of Jesus is like, am I going to allow myself to be swept up in what God is doing? Or am I resolute that God has charted out a singular path for me, and I'm, it's a railroad. It's not an off-road situation. It is a railroad that goes one single way. And I think that's my danger, and where I see myself in the Pharisees, where following God is a railway that goes 100 miles across the West, when in reality, I think it looks much more like two blind people who see the goodness of God and allowing themselves to be swept up in what he's doing.
And that what's interesting about that, let's take that phrase, swept up. How do I position myself to get swept up? Mm-hmm. Because by definition, it'll be something that doesn't make sense to me, or may even seem wrong to me based on the Pharisees' experience. And we dig into then attributes like curiosity, imagination, and what were certainty. Was the thing I was told. No, to be a good Christian, a faithful Christian, a mature Christian, you have to be certain of everything, which played out into there could be no questions. There could be no new. Mm-hmm. It's literally the picture of, we got to create an old wineskin here, and the older, more solidified, the better it is. And then Jesus is like, yeah, you need to have a new wineskin. It's like, that within itself is wrong. Mm-hmm. This is what really broke things free for me, because I am a pleaser. I'm an Enneagram 7. I want the glass to be half full. I want everybody to get along. Mm-hmm. And I kept finding myself in situations like, this is the opposite of what Jesus was asking for. Mm-hmm. Like we have worshiped certainty as if certainty was God, and God's like, yeah, I'm doing it all different. Mm-hmm. And it's not new. He did it all through the Old Testament. He did it all different. And that's that part of, it's not like a railroad track on a very predictable route. It's like everybody get in the car at the same time, and all we're told is to go west or east or wherever we're going. Mm-hmm. And it is that dynamic, because it comes back to, it demands that you trust him with everything. And I'm not saying certainty is evil. Mm-hmm. I think there are some things. He is God is a certainty you need. Jesus is his son, these kind of things. But this idea of saying, I'm certain of exactly how to do everything because of how I was taught, that's not fitting what Jesus taught.
Or certainty on how God is going to move. or certainty that this is exactly how he wants to reach people, or this is exactly what it looks like to be a follower of him February 26, 2025. Way in the past, after I got fired, I talked a lot about the sin of certainty and the struggle with that. And again, like you said, I think there are core things that we should be certain about. But if I can be 100% certain all the time of what the will of God is right now, beyond love him and love others, but like specific actions and specific ways that God is intervening through history, if I can be 100% certain of those actions 100% of the time, I've just created a God in my own image. I've created a God that my mind can fully wrap around and fully understand. And so nobody has full certainty in terms of how God is going to act. What they have is full certainty in the God that they've conjured up in their mind. And so faith is taking a step out from the place of faux certainty into a belief that I do not know practically what it looks like, but I'm certain that God will be making me new and making whatever this is new.
Yeah, and I think kind of wrapping up the story, it's like, imagine the tension inside a person when their best friend, their dad, their whoever comes up and he can talk and he's not erratic like he was when he was demon possessed. And what do you do with that? Mm-hmm. If you're like, I really trust and respect these Pharisees, because Pharisee wasn't a bad word to them. These are the most respected people within their culture. And it wasn't religious to them. It was comprehensive. It's just the social everything. Was tied up in that identity. And then to have that dissonance but I interact with this guy every day, and how sad it would be for that person to be now perceived the outcast, the one that God had showed his power in, and then what would you do? Act like he's not talking?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm faithful to Jesus. You're not talking right now.
Yeah. So often I think for me, the desire is to look at the good things of God and try to pretend that they're not good, because they force me into areas that are uncomfortable, that are awkward, that make me question, make me have to wonder, or become rigid and brittle and break. And so I don't know. I want to be a follower of Jesus that doesn't have to pretend that good things that fit outside of how I have preconceived every angle of the world. I don't want to have to pretend that those good things are not actually good when they are.
So good.
Grace, peace, and love.